welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we have a very special guest. Today we have on Richard Deming. He's an award-winning poet and critic whose work explores the intersections of literature, philosophy, and visual culture. He's the author of 5 books, including Day for Night and Art of the Ordinary. He teaches at Yale University, where he's the director of creative writing, and his newest book, available now, is called This Exquisite Loneliness: What Loners, Outcasts, and the Misunderstood Can Teach Us About Creativity. Richard, thank you so much for coming on, and welcome to the show.
Yeah. Thank you. It's terrific to be here. I'm a fan.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. And so as we normally begin, I'm going to begin with a passage from Richard's book. Richard wrote, "I first began drinking and using drugs when I was about 13. At 15, people started to say I was a nice guy until I got a drink in me. It was 16 when I began to drink so heavily that I lost hours and then whole days to blackouts. My blackouts always had a feel of time hopping teleportation. One moment, I would be taking a long, slow drink from a bottle. Then hours later, sometimes even a day or so, I would suddenly appear back in my body. These moments were much more than jarring. They were dangerous. Sometimes I was in my room or apartment, perhaps in the middle of a sentence. Other times I would drop back into consciousness in a completely different city from where I was when I started to drink. Once I woke up face down in a puddle in a dark alley behind some family-owned appliance store in Montreal, 300 miles from home. A bloody gash opened across my forehead and nose. A few years later, someone asked me what that was like. I compared it to the sci-fi TV drama from the 1990s Quantum Leap. My whole body buzzed and I reappeared in myself, unsure of where I was or even who I was." So I love how your book starts out with this incredible, and I would argue, pretty profound depth of intimacy. So oftentimes, I mean, when people write books like this, it's usually about other people's lives, what their experiences were like. I mean, I've known several authors who've done that, which I listen, I appreciate it, and it's very academic, and they'll write about this person's life, the troubles they've gotten into and whatnot. But it seems like from you kind of couch other people's experiences pretty much within your own. And it seems like for the most part, it's this really vulnerable book that you kind of take elements from other, we'll definitely talk about them, other people and other important thinkers, visionaries, if you want to call them that, and you find a way to link them to your experiences, in this case in particular with loneliness. So can you tell me a little bit about essentially how the book came about and how you saw yourself in these different people? And we don't have to get into each specific person because we're going to focus on them one by one, but I wanted to know how you kind of got this concept and put it together.
Well, I mean, I had started to write other things about loneliness along the road. And when I decided I really needed to start writing a pretty long thing about it, like a book, it was because I was writing about someone who was really lonely, the actor Philip Seymour Hoffman, in a movie that I think was about grief and loneliness and alienation. And that was the moment when it kind of felt like these are the real stakes, because I started really turning to that. I was writing that essay, and a friend of mine had called and said that Hoffman had died of an overdose, and that's when I really felt like there were these stakes. And so some of it is because I was responding to somebody else's loneliness and recognizing my own in it, and my own sort of like alternate reality, or even still, possible reality. But I think that when I started in earnest really writing the book too, there's only so far that I felt like I could go talking about my own loneliness that wasn't just like another iteration. And it was thinking about other people's loneliness that helped me talk about different aspects or facets of it. And ultimately, like, it was, I wasn't conscious of this. This is something that came later, but I was kind of enacting what I think is the argument of the book, which is that, or one of the arguments, which is that by sort of expressing or bringing into the world our sense of loneliness, we can offer an echo to somebody else that then starts their own desire to create something by which they can see and be seen. And so that was really what it was. Like, these people did that for me. And so my writing about it was just a kind of another product of that, another generation of that. And then I hope it kind of spirals out. And my favorite notes and emails that I've gotten already in the short time the book has been out have been from artists and writers who said, yeah, this helped me write this thing, or I went back into the studio after reading the book. And that's truly meaningful to me.
Mm.
Yeah, it appears that in the endeavor to try to sort of parse out, or at least from like a writing perspective, attempt to explain or talk about your own loneliness, right? Or to sort of put into words in the creative process what it is that you may be going through. It feels like even the process of doing that, because to parse out such deep feelings that you may feel like you're separated from others. You may feel like no one understands you. You may feel that you're the only one going through whatever it is that you're going through. But by sort of communicating that through your art, whether it's writing, photography in the case of Walker Evans, or and so on, it appears that it sort of creates a language for loneliness that other people can kind of understand and resonate with. And then it helps them to see that, oh, okay, like there's something I can do about these feelings that I'm going through in that expression. And then I feel like, and you do talk about this in the book, of course, but that's where sort of that link between creativity and loneliness exists in that endeavor to try to describe the indescribable.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really beautifully put. And I think that, and I like too that you said a language of loneliness, because I think that's absolutely right. And I think also it only speaks to the fact that we have such a problem talking about it. And so that there isn't a language for it. I mean, kind of, I'm lonely, that there's a whole range and a whole spectrum of what that could entail. And I think that, providing these models and examples have been important, but I think also just the striving to articulate it, to try to bring into language is really absolutely necessary. I mean, I think that's the first step, is figuring out a way to talk about this stuff. I guess the first step is saying it's okay to talk about it. And the second step is then, how do I do that? And here are people who have tried.
Yeah, I think we often struggle just seeing it as something less personal. And so I'm a psychotherapist, and so what I often deal with patients is the shame around these particular qualities, or let's say aspects of life. Maybe qualities isn't the right term, but like, let's say in terms of a person's circumstances, feeling lonely. And so I can tell you, even from personal experiences, like that's not something I'd even want to admit. Like there are periods in my life where I legitimately don't even really reach out to anybody. People don't even reach out to me, and it's hard to really say that, because especially when you think of I mean, I don't want to really get into too much about like what gender roles are, what should be, but I would argue that in terms of masculinity, the thinking is you kind of have to figure it out, right? Like men aren't really lonely. That seems more of a feminine trait. I know that would be controversial. I don't want to get into what that actually means, but essentially you get the sense that, okay, if I am lonely, like I have to go do something about it. And then also like, yeah, why should you be lonely? Like, are you needy? What does this say about you? And so when you now start thinking about it in more existential terms, and this is, where your work goes, is you're saying that loneliness is an aspect of life, that there's this unbridgeable gap between you and I that's always going to be there. So technically, even though, yes, you can see loneliness in the people who are just isolated and not really connected to anybody in that particular moment, we also can experience loneliness when we're around other people. But again, when it comes to masculinity, it's so hard to admit that, and to say, even let's say, if I'm around people, I don't want to say that I'm lonely, because it's like, what do you have to be lonely about? Look at all these people here, right? And then when you're by yourself, the thinking is like, oh my God, like, why are you so needy? Go read a book, go to the gym, go do something else, And I like that, again, your book in the aspect of it that's vulnerable, that's more personal, that you explore your own kind of loneliness. And that's what I actually want to get into. So can you talk to us a little bit about your experiences with it, how you got to some of these realizations, and then essentially what they did and how they helped you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have really had, chronic loneliness all my life. And, that was certainly a huge part of my, addiction and substance abuse. was trying to navigate that. And, then becomes this, it's really terrible paradox that the lonelier I felt, the more I used to like just kind of survive it or blank it out, which only made me feel more lonely and distant from other people. So then I do more of that, and it's this paradox that the very thing I use to survive it is the thing that's worsening it. And so then when I got sober, and it takes time to, and a lot of work, a lot of internal work to really clarify for myself how much loneliness was and has been part of the equation, part of my DNA, and some of the sense of why I, turned to art, was a musician earlier in life, and did stuff with comedy, and writing was the thing that kind of kept coming back and was my way of sort of locating myself to myself. And so that, this is also, I mean, and you guys have already touched on it, like this is despite having friends and despite having a really great marriage that's been going for years and gets better every year, for me anyway. I have to ask her, but I think it's okay. But I mean, I think that also, you touched on the word that I think is at the core of this, which is need, and that loneliness comes out. I mean, it is a sort of a basic need, that it's like a hunger, that this is how we know that we need to go socialize with other people and have, some engagement and encounters with other people. And we wouldn't necessarily think of, oh, I'm hungry, I'm going to have a sandwich. That wouldn't be needy.
Right.
And so if these things are as natural and intrinsic to our humanity as if loneliness is intrinsic as hunger, then why should we call it neediness? And which is just a pejorative way of saying, yeah, I guess we need other people. And yeah, I do think that that's a real problem. I think it does code in some ways different ways across gender, but it really is that shame. And then loneliness is like, if we're sort of equating it to hunger, there can be periods of time where you're really like that also doesn't minimize it. I mean, if you go too long without eating, you get really sick. And if you go too long without really satisfying relationships with other people, that can create a stress that is also, just harmful even to the body, let alone the emotional life. So I feel like I'm not being specific to your question, but those are, I mean, that's I think if we talk about, okay, here are the consequences, here's the way that we can rethink loneliness, and that I think takes time. And ultimately, like, that goes back to some of the things at the beginning, which was when I started to get some emotional clarity on my life, wanted to really wanted to know what loneliness is, and to acknowledge it in my life, and to find healthy ways of dealing with it, and then rethinking it.
Right. And how did that happen? Right. So, because essentially, going back to where we started with the substance abuse, I mean, it's essentially a weak bomb, for loneliness.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of the fear of experiencing it, the fear of experiencing the shame around it. I mean, you kind of have I guess maybe a cascade, or what would you call that? like you would have a strata of kind of emotions, right, on top of which is most, or I'm sorry, in the bottom of which is shame, and then you have shame, loneliness, you can say depression, the fear of all of this, of it all kind of tumbling down, and then you're experiencing the shame. So when did you, let's say we focused on it or looked at it as an onion, when did you start kind of peeling it back and allowing yourself to experience not only the loneliness but the shame around it, and maybe whether it's a gender norm or whether it's the way you expected to see yourself for whatever other reason, when did you allow to see yourself in that juxtaposition to say, okay, here is this ideal version of myself that I so desperately want to be, but here's who I really am?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think that there was a like necessarily eureka moment. I think some of it had to do with and I talk a little bit about this in the book, which is that I spent a month alone in a cabin on the southern tier of New York State, and I was alone. I had no phone. This was pre-internet, pre-cell phones, and it was a 6 or 7 mile walk into town, and I didn't have any running water. And I was, seriously meditating at the time, and so I did that, and that gave me the purest sense of a solitude, and solitude as a like healthy, chosen condition that is restorative. And so that like that gave me a way of like thinking of the spectrum, that if I could go into that and have that really powerful and healthy and restorative feeling when I felt loneliness, and which is on the same spectrum but feels painful and isn't chosen, it comes upon you, finding that was good to set up that kind of comparative relationship. And then also I think some of it was I think realizing that I could connect with people, that I could write something that other people would respond to, that I could be trying to figure out for myself, and I would write something and other people would catch that. And sometimes even things that I wasn't aware of, like my second book of poems, when I started to send it around for friends and people I admire to look at and get their sort of feedback, I kept getting people writing to me saying, well, this is really fascinating meditation on loneliness. And I'm like, it is? I didn't realize that. And I was a part of that because my process was to stay up really late alone. And my beloved would go to bed. I would then begin to write. I would go running really late at night, like at midnight, and come back. And it would be in this sort of sense of that there's nobody in the world that's awake, and feeling that excitement of creating something, but the sense of there being like loneliness, that there's no one that I could reach out to because they're asleep or they're distant. And like all of these things start to work on me, and it's a crucial thing. But I think and the other thing I would say is, like, when I started to think about what I think of as exquisite loneliness, which is kind of that, which is this sort of self-awareness of feeling lonely, and that it's not just something that I'm in. It's sort of like when you have depression and you can think about being depressed. I mean, it was sort of, I'm lonely. What does that mean about what I need in relationships, or what I'm lacking, or what I want? It was when I spent 6 months in Berlin, and I was at the American Academy, which was really fun and really stimulating. But I'm in a foreign country, and my beloved had to stay back in the States because of her job. And so I was mostly, alone, and I would walk the streets at night, and it was different because it was loneliness caused by the occasion. Like I knew, oh, if I go home, I will have my chronic loneliness, but you know, there are my cats and there are my books and there are these, like, there's my wife and there are all these things. Whereas this, I knew I felt this real intense loneliness, but it was going to come to an end when I left the country. And I had lots of people that I was meeting, which was very exciting, very fun, but there was no intimacy because I was there for 6 months. So like you can meet a lot of people and have a lot of great relationships, but if you're in a place for 6 months, you don't have deep friendship. You just don't have that sort of banked. And so it was like, that was the things that I started to become aware of. It's not even just the number of people you know. And this is, again, like trying to figure out what loneliness is. It's not occasion of like how many people you know, it's how many deep intimacies do you have with people and how much of that do you need. And I think that changes depending on, you know, where you are in your life or what is happening in your life or what you're going through. And that became very clear to me that it wasn't just knowing people, it was the depth of intimacy with people. It was the sense that these were relationships that were going to be ongoing, and so that like a longevity, a built-in life to them. And I think it was that too, that just all these things kind of kept making me think about it. But you know, ultimately, it was the writing of the book that helped me clarify all of these things. It wasn't like, oh, okay, I figured it out, let me take it down. It was, I usually am like, there's a question that I'm wrestling with, and that's why I want to write the book, because I need to just let myself dive deep. And that's what I want to do with loneliness, to really kind of come through to not the other side, because I don't think it goes away, but to figure out what its role in my life is.
Well, I suppose two things. One thing, just very quickly, that I sort of related to is that aspect of, okay, you're away somewhere for 6 months. You almost already know it's guaranteed that you're not going to make any deep relationships with anyone. So it's almost as if even upon just starting that adventure for 6 months, you almost know you will definitely not be making that kind of relationship. And then I could imagine that. I find that actually very relatable. I even find that hope
do tell.
Yeah, so I hope nobody finds this you know, from where I work or anything like that. But when I first started working, I was thinking, well, I don't know how long I'm going to be at this job, right? So of course, you know, I understand you need to, I mean, there's an aspect of, oh, you need to, you know, network with people. It's good for your professional career. Not just that, being truly being authentic and actually fostering, you know, like a good, healthy relationship with people, being, you know, nice and all of that. Genuinely, of course, that's great. However, when you intellectually know that, but then also at the same time, you don't know how long you're gonna be around a certain person or not, you almost wonder, is it worth it to risk you know, be getting so vulnerable to the point of creating that deep bond with someone? I suppose somebody who's more extroverted would argue, I'm overthinking it, right? Or something like that. They might say something like that. But I don't know. I feel like any of my fellow introverts would be like, no, I really connect with that. Like, I need a lot to know that this person's going to be like solid in my life and, you know, connect with them. Can't just meet someone for a week and say, oh, that's my friend from Berlin. You know, I of course won't be talking to them anytime soon, but if I see them in a year, we'll reconnect like nothing happened, or no time has passed rather. But so that was just in a quick aside. I just wanted just to relate to you on that. But in regards to the writing process, or rather loneliness and its link to creativity, and I wanted to ask this to both of you. Do you both feel that as an aspect of loneliness, either thinking a lot or in many cases overthinking kind of occurs? In this might be more of a link to depression or like sort of ruminating thoughts that people might have, but I feel like there's a tie to loneliness here. I noticed that in my own experience, anytime that I was, let's say, lonely or depressed, and I'm kind of thinking about the situation, I would think about every single aspect of it, do a bunch of perspective taking. What is this person thinking? What am I, what if I act like this, will this happen? Well, you start thinking of all the different possibilities. Do you find that overthinking, or we'll just call it, let's call it overthinking. Do you think that contributes to the creative process in the sense that it helps you to take all these different perspectives and write differently, perhaps, or something like that?
Oh, good question. Yeah, Richard, you can go first.
So I have a new theory to me. This is my theory about my own depression, which is that it's all form and no content. And so what it needs is content. And so I'm tend to be the one responsible to give it content. And that's something that I've been sort of consciously trying to work on, is not give it that content, and to say to myself, I feel bad, but I don't have to give it this stuff. I don't have to put wood into that fire to keep it burning. If I feel bad, I feel bad, but it doesn't need to touch anything. I don't need to throw other things in. And so that is sort of a conscious thing. I think that loneliness, loneliness is, there is a way that I think it can, I mean, it's a great question. It's a hard one to answer. And I think it's a hard one to answer sort of in a general way. But I think for myself, it is a lack of intimacy. And I think I feel it more like, I don't have to go look for those kinds of things. I mean, maybe this is helpful as an anecdote, and then Leon, I'd love to hear what you have to say. But one of the reasons that I knew I wanted to write something when I heard about Hoffman's death, I knew that it was going to be but then I was like, well, is this a book? What would this be? And I was at dinner with a friend, and I'm a big fan of horror movies. We've been talking about horror movies. She's a poet. We were talking about poetry, and I don't know, then we shifted to, she had grown up on Long Island, and she said, oh yeah, we always went to Rockaway Beach. And I said, oh, you must love the Ramones. And she said, what? And I said, well, yeah, they have that great song, Rockaway Beach. And I started to sing it. And she said, in the most humane, loving way, she said, the horror movies I get, and there's poetry, and the Ramones, you must be really lonely a lot of time.
Wow.
And I was like, because her sense of like, how do you put these things together? And then who do you talk to? And that was a moment that made me feel like, yeah, exactly, that kind of uniqueness. But I think then where the creativity kicks in is because, and I think actually, Alan, is connected to what you were saying too about that. It's a sense of wanting to create the conditions for intimacy. And so then I create something, and I think that this is true of a lot of the people I look in the book. They create something in order to cast this thing out, or what I like to say is think of like calling to other voices in distant valleys to hear them come back, and by reading something or listening to music and feeling open to it is usually where I feel that loneliness, because I feel connected but distant, because these people are somewhere else. But it makes me want to create something or sort of participate in that exchange of intimacy, even with people I'm not with. Like Egon Schiele died, decades before I was even born. Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I mean, I think that's where that shifts to. So I think, there are all kinds of ways that loneliness can occur. And I think mostly I'm interested in the ones that are sort of chronic, in which case there isn't an occasion. It's different from, like, if you have somebody who dies, obviously you're going to feel that loneliness. But we just had a dear friend die, and periodically my beloved and I are saying, I'm lonely for this person. And yeah, but I think the some people are just sort of more sensitive to, or awake to, or feeling of that kind of existential loneliness. And that's the thing that, like, I think that creates the possibilities of creativity and wanting to reach out with the loneliness to other lonelies.
Yeah, and I think so. My answer is going to be a little darker. So I think with respect to me and how I would sort of conceptualize it, obviously this is not based on my personal experiences. So I remember when I was friends with this person, and one time we were at a bookstore. Like, this was way back when. I think we were at Strand in Manhattan. So we were at a bookstore, and I bought about like 5 books, right? And she looks at me and she says, like, "Oh my God, man." She's like, "You're literally doing this again. You're quelling your loneliness with all of these books." And so here's how I'm going to connect that to writing. So for me, there's a lot of, I would argue, fear and arrogance involved in both respects. So whether I'm reading or whether I'm writing, and here's why I say that. So when it comes to writing, so yes, there's a lot of overthinking involved, but here's the problem. And this is where, I would argue, maybe not a fatal flaw, but it's a major flaw of mine, and the reading too, and I'll tie it into. So when it comes to something like writing, so it's a way for me to make sense of my thoughts, but it's also in an arrogant way, a way for me to piece them together all on my own. So when I write, I'm thinking, okay, I got this, right? Like, I don't need anybody to tell me what to think or what's true about my life. I don't need to sit in therapy, which I'm on and off again with, because I constantly and chronically avoid it. So for me, writing is a way for me to say, okay, like, I got this. Again, going back to that concept of masculinity, right? I don't need anybody. I don't necessarily need help. And so when it comes to books, I do the same thing. So what I do is I'm kind of one step removed from other people, where I can say, okay, fine, I'll admit I need some help, but not like that. Like, I don't need somebody to talk to me about this. I'll just go read a few books about it, like 5, right? And so I'll read the books. And again, it's all very, maybe not necessarily disorganized, but it's jumbled, right? So there's a different idea here, a different idea there, 5 more ideas with this other book. And then you try to piece them all together. And again, it's me saying that I can make sense of this myself. Maybe I need a little bit of help, again, using authors, but then when I piece it all together and then I put it down into, let's say, work, and I write about it wherever, again, the thinking is, I don't need anybody. I can figure this one out on my own. And I would say, for the most part, and this is silly that I'm saying this, because obviously it's super fucking problematic, but I still continue to do it, right? So, but yeah, but essentially that is it, man. Like, so it's the overthinking that gets channeled into writing, and it's I would argue it's a poor way for me to deal with loneliness, because even if I'm, let's say, writing, whether I'm reading, whether I'm getting feedback from people, and let's say I'll get comments and people say, "Hey, I really appreciated this work. Here's how it related to me." I'm always like 5 steps removed from other people. It's not as though I'm sitting in the room. And so, like, technically what I'm doing now is the most vulnerable I've been in like ages, right? Which is, again, pretty unfortunate. And so when it comes yeah, or fortunate, but when it comes to my writing, it's very easy for me to sit behind the screen, or even, let's say, talk to somebody and have them say, "Well, I really enjoyed this work, yada yada yada," and I'm like, "Okay, cool, thank you so much for reading." But do we really ever get into what I'm experiencing, the fact that I'm not really asking for help, the fact that I'm not actually expressing that I am needy to whatever extent? No, we don't get into any of that. So I would argue, in some ways, yes, that writing for me is a balm for loneliness, but it's a very fucking weak one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel that so I know that you said the accolades that you get from your writing, in terms of the reviews that you get, it's not that satisfying,
Right?
Even though there's some level of satisfaction to it, it's not.
Can I differentiate? And Richard, I actually wonder if you experience this too, since now we're on the topic. So would we say that when it comes to sort of the reviews and whatnot, it's a different type, and I would say a weaker type of satisfaction, where you get the dopamine hit, right? You're like, "Oh my God, I feel so good about myself. I'm really useful. This person really liked me." But then when it comes to actual deep satisfaction, again, that's more long-term, that's more sustainable. No, it's probably not that.
It is the actual writing, let's say, or you being vulnerable here, or the writing is that in any way cathartic in terms of expressing at least like loneliness in this case? Is
Yeah.
it anything
Yeah,
cathartic?
it's nice because I feel like since the both of you haven't shamed me for saying that, I feel like that's nice, right? I get to experience something that I probably hid, for ages. So, and again, and I'm not getting the feared consequence, which is really nice. So, and I wonder, going back now to Richard and your work, and I wonder if in some ways that you're kind of seeing that in some ways the writing is kind of removed from the world in whatever way. And it's like, it's not to say that it's bad or good, it's not that simple, obviously, but it's to say that it's only sort of a step toward intimacy. It's not actually intimacy itself.
The actual writing.
Yeah, the writing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, it's a really great question. And I love when these things are really like conversations like this. It's much more fun for me. Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's complicated. I mean, I think that it's a both and. I mean, I think that I think that the process of writing for me is a kind of well, it's both, because it's not only intimacy which suggests, okay, I'm being vulnerable. But I think intimacy has to be, by its nature, has to be reciprocal. So I have to not only be willing to be vulnerable, I have to be willing to be receptive. And so in the case of writing, it also means that I want to think about not how to please people, but how to say something that makes them feel okay to be open as well. And so that I have to really think about how other people experience things. Like, because we have that, I mean, you have that kind of experience all the time, in which you meet with somebody and then they start telling you all this stuff, and it seems like it's very revealing, but they're not inviting you in. They're just sort of like confessing it at you. And that to me doesn't necessarily, like, I can weaponize my emotional life and cudgel people with it, but I think it's much more it's much more powerful for me to think about not only what will I reveal, but why am I, and am I doing it for the sense of opening something up for other people, and then be willing to hold on to that, like to have that happen. And that's I think that's where it really happens. That's where the intimacy really could occur. So I think, but I mean, I think that there is then the tricky part of it too, which is no one will ever read something as carefully as you wrote it. And it's not because they're not caring, or it's just, that's just the economy of it. It's just the economy of it. And I can have some really gratifying, moving responses. But I also don't necessarily see their emotional life as well. But there's a little bit of then a sense of, I mean, I'll say it, faith, that it's doing some good. But also, if I thought that like I solved everything in a book, then I wouldn't need to keep writing. And I feel like, oh, there's more that I could say, there's more that I could do, there's more that I could there's more to be said about everything. And so that, is what pushes me to write the next thing.
Yeah, because when we think about, just again going back to writing, that's why my understanding of it was that it's the beginning of a connection, or hopefully the beginning of a connection, because it's very easy to have sort of two lonely people say, okay, hey, here's my book about on loneliness, and then have somebody respond and say, hey, I really like that, I feel lonely too, okay, bye, right? So
Yeah.
it's kind of, yeah, so the hope is that you actually sit there within it, and it's one thing to say, okay, I feel enough courage to actually put this down on paper, have it become public. That's amazing, because obviously, I would argue very few people are able to do that. But then it's another thing to actually sit there with your work and have a deep conversation with the other person, and actually talk about how these experiences connect with their experiences, to say, okay, this is how you and I kind of can relate to each other, and this is how we've dealt with it in the past. So I feel like what we're doing now is that, we're saying, okay, here's how we've experienced loneliness, here's how it's impacted us. So I think for us, and this is why I love podcasting just in general, it's like it's reading, but it's and writing, obviously, and it's a step above that. It's saying, okay, let's actually not only make this work useful, but let's actually reveal it to one another in a way that's very sort of profound and very touching, and very it's a way for it's even though there is a kind of screen in front of us, obviously, but it's a way that sort of surpasses the technology, and that allows us to connect in a very kind of spiritual way that, again, it sort of in some ways bridges that existential gap, at least momentarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think this stuff can be really, I really do think it's moving. And I think there's a reason that like there's 1,000 podcasts and that, but a billion people listening to them, because like, something like this, you can have, and I've done a few of these lately, which is, hey, we're talking to Richard Deming, author of This Exquisite Loneliness. Hey, Richard. But something like this, which feels like an actual conversation, and like in some ways, like for introverts, it's kind of the ideal one. Like we skip all of the like small talk, and we, where are you from? We're like right into it, and saying, wow, I'm feeling more vulnerable in this moment than maybe I have been, recently. Like that, there's a kind of like nice, authentic honesty to that. And I think that like if we all say, yeah, I'm at least trying to be very vulnerable, and that I'm thinking about intimacy. Well, first of all, that if we do think about it in gender terms, and we're three guys talking
about our feelings.
There's a theme here, similar haircuts. But I think that like just even doing that is like, it's really hard to have that kind of conversation, even with people, and so like I do think that that's a beautiful thing. And I do, I also, although no one, I said, no one will ever read my books as carefully as I wrote them. I still think of them as like just the sign of the work, not the work itself. The work itself is the process of doing it. And yeah, and also like the thing that we didn't talk about is there's the other vulnerability of someone like talking to you about your work, and like I don't know what to say when they kind of like are saying really nice things. Like that, I get self-conscious of that too. And like so there's all kinds of like, there is all kinds of dissonance, and
I'm sorry, Richard, can I actually ask you about that? So
yeah.
I mean, because it seems so counterintuitive, right? That you would get a compliment, then you would think, oh man, this is kind of making me cringe. What do you suppose that's about?
Well, in my life, it means it's probably a setup for some like dig or slight. I mean, I think that's like, I'm not ruling that out, like that's certainly something I've always, that I, had to it's a very waspy upbringing, but used to that kind of thing. But it also like, for whatever reason, it also does make me think of the things I didn't do or didn't say. And also, to be really honest, like also, letting people down is sort of a big fear. And so that like that, like it's like if they start to say positive things, then I worry that then in the moment I won't come through, I won't deliver Yeah, it's all those kinds of things that are really, that make it really complicated. But in the long run, if someone says to me, "Oh, this is great," and they, this really moved me, like obviously that is gratifying. I mean, I'm not gonna deny that.
Mhm.
But if someone says, this really moved me, so I sat down and started to write an essay about, my brother dying when I was, 9, that's like, that to me, that's what we're about. Like that's all I wanted. All
Mhm.
I, that's the hope, that like that's what passes. I mean, Emily Dickinson has this poem: "The poets light, but lamps themselves go out. The wicks they stimulate, if vital light inheres do the suns." I mean, that idea that, whatever you make is just to get other people going and to create more possibility for voices. And then they write something that turns me on, that then
Yeah.
I go and write something, and then that turns somebody else on. Like that's the conversation. That's the kind of intimacy and vulnerability that I think is really generative. And like I said, create not in the sense of like, I get to say my voice. It means literally to create things that move people. And so like, I want to be moved. So I want to set up the conditions in which it helps facilitate somebody else creating something. So then I can be moved by that. Like
Mhm.
that to me is really, really the thing that I'm most touched and gratified by.
Mhm. Yeah, Alan's really like that a lot too.
No, totally. And actually, speaking of being moved, and I know this, again, this is like probably also one of those cliche questions you might get on like terrestrial radio or one of those podcasts, but really should ask this though. In terms of being moved, is there any particular figure who you mentioned in your book, like whether it's Melanie Klein, Zora Neale Hurston, Walter Benjamin, or so on, that you sort of connected with?
Oh, they all do. I mean, they're all really from my own my own reading.
Yeah.
Like that idea, buying all these books to quell the loneliness. I mean, that every one of them at some point, and continue to be, like that old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So many of them like appeared at this, you know, moment that I felt really, really ready for them. I mean, a lot of them, like say Rod Serling, I didn't know so that much about his own life. I just knew that my beloved went away to a residency, um, for a few months, and I said, I'm going to do something that she wouldn't go with, which is watch, the Twilight Zone every night, just half an hour, watch it through. I've seen every episode all my life, but I'd never seen it in that sort of like really focused way. And I just wanted to see what would happen, because, and so that I knew that I realized how much of that show is really about loneliness.
Mm.
And that's when I was like, I really want to, like, why is Serling writing about these shows, about these episodes about loneliness? What is it? And I knew about his death, but I didn't know much about his life. And then to really find out about him returning from the war, from World War II, and his father had died, and he didn't even know, because of the military mail being so messed up, and his mother had moved, and like he comes back to his really beloved home, and everybody's gone. Like to come back from war, to be not homeless in the sense of, living on the street, but the place that you felt like I'm fighting for, like all the people you had loved are kind of gone. Like that was really, really powerful. So they all became really, none of them let me down. All of them became much, much more moving the more I realized the space that they were writing from. And then it made sense to me that they would be writing about or painting about, or thinking about loneliness. Yeah, I mean, they all really delivered and more. So I
Yeah.
got closer to them. Yeah.
So I love the Twilight Zone. I have to ask, what's your favorite episode?
I mean, I think that first one, Where Is Everybody?
Yeah.
In which, he comes into town and everybody's gone, and there is like the coffee is boiling on the stove, and he's just missing everybody. And then there's the turn at the end, and that was the one that I knew that I watched that one because I watched it first, and that's when I realized, oh, wait a minute, are all of these? And that's when it started to unfold. Why? What's your favorite?
Oh, A Game of Pool. Do you remember that one?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
And talk about loneliness. I mean, essentially, you have this guy who's obsessed with success over a fucking like billboard game, billiard. Yeah, and it's like, and it billboard. So, and it's like, you're kind of wondering the entire time, like, how is he throwing his life away? And then and then this other person comes to him and he says, Fats, I think his name was Fats Brown or something. So I think, he comes to him and he says, like, dude, stop this. Like, even though I was, the number one player in the area or whatever it was, I have this life. Like, I had like partners, I've been to vacations, I've been outside of the country. And I really wondered for Rod Serling if that was an aspect of his life that he was maybe not necessarily let's say not necessarily preoccupied with, but at least maybe curious about, where with that kind of success, I mean, there is a sense of isolation and loneliness. I mean, you could see this with athletes, whomever else, right? Musicians, etc. I mean, they spent, like Prince, great example. He was notorious for this. He'd spend 8 hours a day literally just writing in the studio, and then much of his other time was spent recording. So he spent a lot of time by himself. So you wonder with these super successful people, like how much is the trade-off really worth it? Because for the most part, and when they do die, I mean, yes, they have adoring fans and whatnot, but speaking of intimacy, they don't have much of that in their lives.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly, I mean, that's very perceptive. That's exactly the sorts of things that we understand him to have felt, because the Twilight Zone and just his general success, like he was really famous. I mean, especially as a writer, as a television writer, there's kind of no one like it now. And he was his own kind of brand, but also having to churn out all this content. And, he was living in LA, and there's some distance from his kids. And, and also just, he really, like, you see this a lot in the episodes of the Twilight Zone. He just wanted to go home. He really wanted to go back to Binghamton, into that life. Though I wanted to ask you guys, since you've been doing this podcast, which is really about, I mean, it's about a lot of things, but people's feelings, like, are you able to internalize that? Like, and how is it coming back to you in those ways that you feel like you're really connecting to people, or do you?
Well, just to be clear, and internalize what specifically? Just so I know I understand the question.
Well, I mean the kinds of things, that you guys are talking about, which is, touches on connection, and either philosophically or psychologically, or like, these are still ways of being in the world. And so that, it provides a kind of reaching out to other people, and that's what a podcast is. And I was wondering, from your side of things, like how you've been getting, how there's some kind of confirmation for your own wanting to create the situation where you reach out to other people, or help other people reach out to your listeners.
Yeah, so I mean, at least from my perspective, especially when we first started the podcast, of course, we didn't have many listeners. So, what sort of keeps you going at that point, right? And the idea was sort of the purpose, which was, all right, we want to make knowledge that's not yet widely accessible more widely accessible. Now, of course, there were other podcasts doing this. You have already people like Rogan and or whatever, eventually at some point Lex Friedman, and you have all these different podcasters, physicists and whatever, a lot of educational podcasters, right? So they exist. However, it still felt like as if that information was still not everywhere, or it wasn't hitting every kind of person or every sort of demographic. Like you almost wanted certain things, like maybe just something as simple as just critical thinking, or what is nuance, right? Oh, there's more than one thought or one or more layer to this thing you're thinking about, especially like politically or something like that. Like that's new to some people. Concepts of like understanding like what is, let's say, the ego in terms of like sort of like a false concept of oneself. And maybe like if somebody didn't know this, I learned this only in my early 20s. And imagine like I went 20 years without knowing this, that like, oh, this voice that it was in my head, like in terms of like a ruminating voice, not like a brainstorming, like you're trying to come up with something voice, kind of just like one that would be sort of conditioned and maybe not saying good things. I didn't realize that that's just sort of like a pattern that was running in my head, not literally something that if I asked myself, like, would I treat myself like this or say these things, like, why is it occurring? And then I started to make certain distinctions, and I was like, oh, can you introduce that to people? And maybe even earlier than maybe when I was introduced, something like that. And like certain little ideas that, so what's the main point? The main point is the purpose in the actual action of doing the service, right, was fulfilling and is still fulfilling.
That's your connection.
Yes. Now, if we go to now, and it's been, what would you say, 5 years?
Yeah, 5. Yeah.
So now we get more feedback, right? It's still not huge, but we do get that feedback. There are people who really do appreciate the show. Now, have I seen anybody say anything like, you guys have changed my life or something like that? I haven't seen anything like that. Not that I'm looking for it, but that's just, I feel it's almost necessary to say that. But we've definitely got.
Throwing a joke there. Well, sort of a joke.
So actually, go.
Friends, yeah, he said he's like, I mean, he enjoys, so he watches and listens to this podcast like periodically, and he says to us like, oh, it's so interesting, like you guys talk about all of the things that I already knew. But like, did you want to finish?
Well, okay, so one other thing I would say is that the feedback is better, right? So but it doesn't necessarily, at least personally, motivate me. It's still more like just the goal of the purpose of doing the service. That's the thing that's kind of making it self-sustaining. But another thing that's been very fulfilling in terms of like things that we internalize is, depending on, I mean, this is goes for all of our guests, but sometimes once in a while there might be one particular or conversation that like both me and Leon will agree, like whoa, like sparks are flying, like whoa, like first of all, the things that like we reveal about ourselves or how we emote or how the guests like expresses themselves that particular podcast, or maybe we had like a few laughs or something like that, and it's just like a generally good vibe, or maybe you just learned something or talk about something in a way that you haven't before.
Right.
It helps us to sort of internalize that new knowledge and kind of bring it to the next podcast in that sense. So that's my answer in a nutshell. I know I just said,
yeah. Well, you know what's so funny, and you're gonna see the contrast right now, because my answer is incredibly fucking simple. So literally, the only connection that I feel, right, I don't know what connections I have, kind of objectively speaking, whatever that even is. So the only real connections I feel and the only connections I want from a really fucking super selfish perspective is that, so from Richard, from guys like you, and women too, obviously, from the guests that we have, I feel like I'm able to connect with people who are almost exactly like me, and it's something that I don't really get to experience much in my life. So whether it's like my work or whether it's with friends, family, whatever, I mean, it's not even that, I don't want to say that people are so distinct from me, because that's not necessarily true, but in terms of the things that I have interest in, the topics that I like to talk about, I don't normally get that on a day-to-day basis. So with that said, a lot of times, really, so I mean, I don't really know what's, again, going back to that screen, man, I don't really know what's going on with the audience, right? So they'll leave us messages, they'll say nice things, I like it, and obviously it's an ego boost, it makes me feel good about myself, no doubt. But the real connections, if we're talking about, if we're using using that term, right? The real connections I actually feel are with our guests. So the fact that we can have a conversation, time flies, I don't even notice it. And I'm like, oh my fucking God, this person really understood me for like whatever it was, the hour
Right.
15. I felt not only understood, but I also felt really appreciated. So not only did they get me, and I obviously got them, but on top of that, they also loved the fact that I gave them the space. They love the fact that I enjoyed their work. They love the fact that, I don't know, they even like the fact that they, let's say I said things or I was clever and I looked smart and all of these other things, right? So there's this connection and there's this kind of reward that you get with the actual person. I'm not necessarily sure I'd ever get that with anybody from the audience. I mean, unless I had a personal relationship with them. So yeah, for me, it's really all about the guests. It's a super selfish answer. So.
Well,
No, I totally get it. I mean, I think that's it. Like, you've got to feel like, this is something that is kind of a truism about writing, but I think it's true also of these sorts of things. Like, if you don't learn anything in the doing of it, then the audience won't. And I think that's like the true in writing. And I think it's true in talking. Like, if I'm just talking and I'm not getting anything, I'm not getting, like interesting, exciting questions, or like, bringing up something that I hadn't even thought of or even thought to ask myself. Like, I get something out of it, and then it's like I'm back in. Otherwise, we can just fall back into a kind of like just doing a script. But I think also, Alan, too, like along with that is that like what we seem to maybe be on is that it's really the process of it, and which is, again, that's creativity. It's the process of the thing. It's the creation of the thing, not the thing that's created. And that's why you kind of never want it to end. Like, you don't, you kind of fantasize that you want the thing to write the thing that answers every question, and that you say one sentence and, men and women fall at your feet, and like, that would be, on one hand, that seems great. On the other hand, then I'd be done and I'd be bored. Like, I need, like it's the built-in sense of like, oh, there's more that we could say, or more that we could, and then that other people give that to us. Like, like, so like one really great conversation doesn't end at all. Like, then you talk to somebody else and they bring out a different angle. And so then you kind of start like combining all this stuff. And I really think about it like, maybe it's because I'm from Massachusetts, which is a commonwealth, not a state. And I think that's really what it is. It's a sort of commonwealth of human experience that we're trying to pay into and take out from, but it's that collective thing. But it's why, again, going back to shifting from needy to need, is this is why we need other people, because they help us become who we are.
Yeah. And I love that. And I love the connectivity and all of it. So when you look at it as this hodgepodge of ideas, I mean, essentially you're feeding off of one another. And I think what you're getting at, again, in looking at the different aspects of loneliness, so being around people, even just getting praise. And by the way, I know, I mean, I kind of said this, but not really, but this is like another problem of mine, like where I just get stuck in the praise. I'm like, okay, cool. I got praise. I'm done. Like, I don't want anything more to do with any of this. But that doesn't really make sense, because again, people give you such cool, or at least can, right? It's possible. They can give you such great feedback that it makes you, or it changes your perspective. It shifts your thinking. And I think for me, who's a lot of times afraid of being wrong, obviously, I mean, literally the shirt fucking says it, so yeah. My cousin got me this shirt too as a joke, which not that funny. but my point is to say that, right, so I love the fact that you're pretty much saying that again, there's a sort of a bastardization of connectivity that we have to move past in order to, again, work with one another and understand that we do need each other, and we need each other not just for emotional reasons, but also for intellectual, where I'm assuming, Richard, from your work, you pretty much, in learning from these other people and the people you've spoken with, have had relationships with, you've built upon your ideas of loneliness. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the only really through the talking about it and the writing about it do I really find ways to immerse myself in it. And that's, I think that's part of, I mean, I think that like that is part of the introversion, is really because I don't like have a lot, I'm not good at small talk, and I don't have a lot of, like, it's just not all that valuable to me. I've like I like this. Like this is now we're doing something. Like the rest I could do by myself, but this kind of thing, like you guys have asked a lot of questions that are new to me, new questions that people haven't asked, and and also because you're being real and you're bringing your own experience. Like again, I can't anticipate that. So then like it just adds to that in a way that is really exciting to me. And the best thing is that I still learn about, say, my book or my thinking about loneliness by it's not done. Like the life of this stuff continues, and I get to be part of a conversation.
Right, which evolves. Yeah. All right. So as we start to wrap up, Alan, final questions for Richard before we go.
Yes. So if we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
I am not on social media for the most part, so that's bad.
That's okay.
But yeah, I mean it's on Viking Penguin, so it's pretty much available at any bookstore, or certainly on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. But yeah, it's pretty easy to get a hold of.
All right.
Awesome.
All right, Richard, thank you so much for coming on, man.
This is cool.
I really, really appreciated the vulnerability, man. And just the fact that you even are able to write about it. Like even that little snippet that I read from your book. I mean, yeah, usually people don't talk about those experiences, or at the very least, it's sort of like a hero's journey. And it's like, oh, here's how I overcame, right? And I like that for you. It was like, no, like these are the things that I'm still kind of ashamed of.
Yeah, it's ongoing. The struggle is real, brother.
Yeah. So thank you so much again, man. We'll be in touch with you soon.
Take care.
Thanks so much, guys. You guys be well now.
Absolutely, man.
All right. So everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On Twitter, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.